If I can just ask the panelists to come up, that would be fantastic, and I'll just give you a brief introduction to all of them. Our first panelist at the right is Professor Carlota McAllister of the Department of Anthropology here at York, and she's the Deputy Director of CERLAC. Her research focuses on the formation of political and moral agency in situations of violent conflict. Her first field work was in Guatemala, and she's now working on a dam conflict in Chile. Her co-edited volume, War by Other Means, Aftermath and Post-Genocide Guatemala, is coming out with Duke University Press in fall 2013. In the center, our panelist, Caren Weisbart, is the 2011 winner of CERLAC's Baptista Essay Prize for her insightful analysis of contemporary political economy and cultural politics in Guatemala. Beyond recognition, alternative rights realizing strategies in the northern Quiche region of Guatemala. Caren lived and worked in Guatemala from 2001 to 2010, where she also served as director of an international human rights accompaniment project, ASOGUATE. Caren's presently a doctoral candidate in environmental studies here at York. And then our last panelist is Omar Cano, who is a graduate of the Universidad de San Carlos and a journalist who worked for two of the main newspapers in Guatemala during this period, Prensa Libre in Siglo XXI, until he was forced into exile during the government of Jorge Serrano Elias. In Canada, he's been involved with various community newspapers, including El Centro Americano, and Omar is also a co-founder of the Guatemalan Canadian Association, ASOGUATE, a nonprofit group working to preserve the Guatemalan culture in Canada. They support different social and educational projects in Guatemala. So welcome, thank you so much for coming tonight. And I thought we'd start off by giving each of you 10 minutes to sort of comment on the film and talk about how it relates to your specific areas of work. So if you'd like to start, that would be great.
Sure. Is this on? Can you hear me? Or do I need, is it, okay, great. I'm so pleased to be here tonight. It's such an extraordinarily moving movie, and it's wonderful that there's such an audience for it. I'm going to talk about this sort of from a personal perspective related to my work, but also my experience in Guatemala. In the late 1990s, I worked as a volunteer for the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology team with Freddy Pecharelli and other people. And in the early 2000s, I worked for Kate Doyle, who appears in the movie as well, as a research assistant on the Guatemala and Mexico projects of the National Security Archive, which is the body that Kate works for. That time, the late 1990s and the early 2000s, were a moment, there was a lot of ferment at that moment in Guatemala. The peace accords were signed in 1996, and there was a very brief but beautiful moment where I think people felt a lot of hope about what peace meant and what would come next. And there was a sort of hiatus in this kind of ongoing history of terrible violence. There was sort of, it was quite a nice time actually to be in Guatemala from 1997, 1998. The hiatus sort of started to end with the death of Bishop Gerardi in 1998. And there were signs that things were not going to stay so nice came quickly thereafter. In 1999, there was a referendum held on legal projects to implement the peace accords, which was defeated, which was a huge setback for what people had hoped for from peace. In 1999, Portillo, Alfonso Portillo, who was who represented Rios Montt's party, was elected president, and so on and so forth. Things rapidly declined thereafter. And Guatemala today, of course, is suffering extraordinarily violence again, now no longer under the sign of political violence, but terrible violence nonetheless. So it's in this context that I want to think about what this movie means and what this kind of project for justice means. So that's just to frame my own stake in this. And I want to say that my own hopes and desires and energy were very invested in these projects, these sort of truth-finding, truth-telling, forensic kind of projects. So just to put that up front. But I want to say that I show this movie. I teach a class on the anthropology of human rights, and I show this movie in that class, but I show it as a cautionary tale about the costs of the rule of law, more than as a kind of heroic tale about finding justice. And I do that, I'll talk about this, maybe a room full of lawyers. It's not a great place to do this, but I see, first of all, it's been 30 years since the genocide happened, and I think Caren's going to talk about this more, but it's only now, Riesmont, over the past few days, has been, once again, they're deciding whether he's going to be tried for genocide. 30 years is a very long time to wait for justice. And even I think of myself, when I started working with a forensic anthropologist, they'd already been doing exhumations since 1991. And here they are still today doing exhumations, and they're still, who knows how many, 100,000 plus bodies in the ground waiting to be exhumed. And there's this kind of endlessness about this search that can be dismaying if you've participated in it. You see people saying, I see Freddie saying, they're afraid of us, we're gonna come after them, and we've been saying that for a long time. And so there's a sense in which I want to put the process, the politics of seeking justice through the law in that context of these 30 years, these 20 years, these 10 years, or whatever moment you choose to insert yourself in. So that's one thing I want to say, and that's what I try to show my students when I do this. What does this take from people to do this work over such a long period of time? And what does it take for the victims to wait for this amount of time? I think, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. So when I was in Guatemala, I was doing my doctoral research, and I went to work with a forensic anthropologist because I was interested in thinking about how exhumations make human rights a material part of your life in some way that simply talking about human rights don't. So the process of recuperating these material remains of the dead, what kind of flesh did this give to the notion of human rights? So I spent about 6 months working on exhumations in the context of the Truth Commission. The exhumations I worked on were for the Truth Commission's findings. And then I went to live in a community called Chupol, a Maya Quiche community in the highlands, which was a sort of notorious killing center during the war. The army came and occupied the church in Chupol, and it's right on the Pan American Highway, leading up to Huehuetenango and the Quiche, which was where there were really strong guerrilla bases. And so it was this place where people would get pulled out of buses and taken up to the church and killed and all these things. This notorious killing center. So I spent about 1.5 years living in Chupol. And one of the things that I discovered when I was living there, and I'll talk more about this in a second, was that the discourse of human rights, which in some sense human rights activists see themselves as introducing, the discourse of rights pre-existed human rights, and it existed in the form of a kind of revolutionary notion of rights, so that the right to rise up against injustice was when people talked about derechos, and they would say, nosotros somos derechos humanos, derechos humanos, is Quiche for we. What they were talking about was not so much this notion of doing justice to victims, but rather this kind of revolutionary notion of rising up and taking justice into your hands. And what I found as I went through this period, and I sort of contrasted these two kinds of understandings of rights, the one that comes out in this project of forensic anthropology or the Truth Commission or all these things, of a kind of restoring something to victims, versus this kind of quite alive, while I was there, notion of a revolutionary rising up against injustice, what I found was that this notion of the kind of victim-centered notion of rights actually made it quite difficult for people to talk about the notion of rights, which was their history, which was this notion of rising up. And I'll say that, I was telling Caren, the scenes in the film where you see her going into the mountain, those were filmed in Chupol. It was a stronghold of the guerrilla army of the poor. People were very committed to that project, and they gave their lives and their hopes and their love to that project. And one of the costs of the rule of law is that it makes it quite difficult in some sense to talk about those hopes, that love, that commitment, and so on and so forth. So that's another thing I try to talk to my students about, is that rights are complex constructs, complex concepts, and that we might not always mean the same thing when we talk about rights, and that it's probably important to create space in which we can talk about these other notions of rights. And you see even in the movie, one of the men from Chupol talking in the movie, he said, these are our rights, right? We're fighting for our rights. And I want it to be possible discursively and practically for people to talk about that in Guatemala. That's sort of my personal intellectual project in Guatemala. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about here. The way, and it's interesting, even in the movie, when I was working in Guatemala in the late 1990s, it was very difficult for people to even mention or talk about or acknowledge their revolutionary experience because the war was so recent, I think. And because the army really won the war in a lot of ways, as we see here, there wouldn't be this kind of impunity if the army hadn't won the war. And so for people to even talk about this was kind of inviting people to accuse them of being responsible for their own victimization. So to say, I participated in the guerrilla army of the poor, I was a militant, or I wasn't even a militant, I was part of the social base of the guerrilla movement, was inviting people to say, well, you deserved what you got then. And I think that was strong, it was a strong feeling in the 1990s, and I think it persists in many ways in Guatemala today, although perhaps it's not quite as strong as it once was. And you see, it's interesting, in the movie, the movie does talk about that experience, and it's actually quite unusual in talking about Guatemala's past for the weight of that experience to be recognized, the weight of what it meant to participate in a revolutionary movement. And it was a massive revolutionary movement that's not so recognized in historical representations of what happened in Guatemala in the kind of era of human rights. And yet, even she who was present there, who felt this hope and this love, ends up kind of denying the power of that experience. She says, well, I used to be a romantic. There were these heroic guerrillas. But now I know, after the genocide, what's the point of even talking about that experience, she says at some point. So now I know that that was all kind of false, this hope, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think that it's not appropriate to talk about that hope as being false, and that it's really important, in fact, for thinking about justice in Guatemala, for that hope to be recognized and valued and brought forth, along with the horrible crimes that were committed to extinguish that hope. Because that's what those crimes were about, was extinguishing that hope, making it impossible for people to engage in projects like that, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't just racism. It was partly racism, and racism certainly informed the shape that all of this took. But it was also about making sure that people did not rise up for justice again. And I think that that, for me, is a really critical dimension of recent Guatemalan history, and one that the emphasis on the rule of law sometimes makes it difficult to bring out. So that's another thing I want to say about this. And the final thing is, it's interesting, and I think Caren will talk more about this because she knows more about this than I do, but the rule of law is also, and I try to tell my students this as well, very costly in all kinds of ways. It's quite expensive. If you think about all these people flying to Spain, it's costly in terms of time. If you think about those documents, that incredible 80 million documents were found in those police archives, and people have spent 4 or 5 years going through those documents, and they haven't even gotten anywhere near through these documents. Exhumations have been going on for more than 20 years now. There's a kind of investment of time and and money, because these things are costly too. That is important, hugely important. It's hugely important to have justice done and to do away with impunity. But there's also a lot of other things that people could spend time and money on in Guatemala, because Guatemala has current political conflicts that are equally horrible as the things that happened in the past. And so I want to also, you see a movie like this and it seems very heroic and beautiful, and it is heroic and beautiful, but at the same time, one wonders, what about all the other stuff? You hear Antonio Cava talking briefly about the hydroelectric plants that they're building, and yet we don't hear anything about that. And yet that's a hugely important struggle that's going on in Guatemala these days. And so the risk of sounding pessimistic about the law and about human rights, these are the reflections that this movie produces in me. Yeah, what are the costs of this as a way of going about justice, I guess, is the question that I would ask of this movie. So, yes, thank you.
What we'll do is we'll move on to the other speakers, and then you can address questions. We'll have a question and answer period at the end, and you can address speakers to whoever you think, questions to whoever you think would be appropriate to answer them. Caren, would you like to speak now?
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Great. I'm really excited to be here tonight, and thank you for the invitation. I actually first saw this film in its inauguration in Guatemala City. So my responses to it are partly informed by the conversations I had with friends following the showing of the film, and also some of my own sort of guttural responses immediately following, and now informed by some of my thought processes as I'm starting out in a new PhD program. So sort of shifting from the work that I did in Guatemala to take more of an academic role. I think I also want to say that as a white female Canadian working in Guatemala, I've done a lot of reflecting on what my role and what my responsibility is in those spaces, and how that informs how I share my experiences and the things that I've learned in Guatemala here in Canada and in other countries where I've spoken. And I guess with this film, one thing that I want to focus in on is definitely related to one of the comments that, even one of the comments that was made at the very beginning of the film by the narrator. She asks, how does each of us weave our own responsibility into the pattern of history? Which I think is a really important question that she starts out with, and I think it's also a really interesting question when we think about our own responses to films like this, and sort of the emotion that may be evoked, and also how we use films like this as education tools. So I want to pick up a little bit on also something that Rigoberta Menchú says at the end of the film, which is the importance of not seeing individuals as heroes. And I think that's a really important component to consider. And it's a piece that I feel the film, so I want to talk a little bit about the Association for Justice and Reconciliation, which is the group of witnesses that have been involved in the genocide case since the late 90s, and most specifically since 2000, when the national genocide case was launched. It's an organization that actually was not mentioned in here. Antonio Cava is the president, but for some reason they didn't go into the detail of the association, which is, for me, one of the most heroic groups of people, because they're the survivors of the massacre, and they're the people, the massacres. They're also people who, on a daily basis, continue to live next to the perpetrators of the violence. And they continue to take risks as they come into the city to give their testimonies, to travel to Spain to give their testimonies, as this film shows. But they're also the ones who are continuing to live in really complicated situations of insecurity in contexts of violence that are being perpetuated today, as we're seeing the incursion of hydroelectric projects and mining projects and oil projects on the very same land where their families were massacred. So all of the people that were portrayed in this film are, for sure, amazing, inspiring people who have done important work and have contributed to the struggle for justice in Guatemala. But I don't understand. I don't understand why the Association for Justice and Reconciliation wasn't mentioned, because they're the ones who ultimately employ, in many ways, all of the people there that were mentioned. So I guess I just want to focus in on that, and I also want to mention that I think that in any documentary, it's really hard to cover everything. There's political decisions that have to be made, and there's also a need to figure out how you're going to focus the film, and also how the film is then going to be used and mobilized in different spaces. And I think the idea of this film was to use it as an educational tool in Canada and the United States specifically. And I think as an educational tool, it's excellent because it provides the opportunity to hear about what happened in the past. And I think it provides an opportunity to see how people have struggled to get the word out about what occurred during the height of the violence and connect that to the genocide cases, which are ongoing today. And I think like any educational tool, when we have these spaces to talk and to share and to go maybe beyond where the film let off, it's a perfect opportunity to bring in some of the things that weren't mentioned. A lot of people after the inauguration of the film last spring, and this is a slightly different version actually from what we first saw, but we're really disappointed because it gave the impression that everything in Guatemala was mostly resolved. That the cases didn't quite go forward, but at least people were moving forward themselves, and there's children now going to school, and things are getting better. But I want to just mention that over the last 3 days, the genocide cases have actually gone back to court, so they've actually officially begun, which is a very exciting piece for many people. But what we're hearing in the transcripts, and they're sort of live streaming it currently, so what we're hearing is that the defense lawyer for Rios Montt is sort of spinning the same discourse that they've always spun about hiding what really happened, and that there was no genocide. And they take the work of Kate Doyle, who appears in this film, and she has done incredible work in uncovering information about Plan Sofia, which is the military document that was shown here in the film, and to validate the authenticity and to demonstrate that it was, it clearly demonstrates the linkage between Rios Montt and the massacres and the ordering of the massacres. And the lawyer today, in fact, just basically said that Kate Doyle is not an expert, and she shouldn't have been, she hasn't been given the merit to authenticate a document, and that's not even the original document. And and this is 2 years after the document was sort of lost, and we weren't really sure what happened, and it was supposed to be handed over to authorities, and the night before the night before it was, sort of taken away and disappeared for a few months and then eventually appeared. So there's just sort of these ongoing attempts to erase the past. And I think that's really important to underscore. And also, I just wanted to bring to light as well some of the recent decisions, some of the legal decisions that the Guatemalan courts have put forward. One related to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, which has been looking at a lot of these massacres at the international level, and trying to put forward, or trying to determine responsibility on the Guatemalan government for mostly massacres that took place prior to 1987. And so recently the justice system in Guatemala basically said that they're not going to recognize anything that comes from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, at any case relating to Guatemala prior to 1987, which is basically when the genocide took place. And that's a step back when we're talking about impunity, the fight and the struggle for impunity in Guatemala. And then currently, sort of alongside the genocide cases, there's another case in the Constitutional Court that pertains to an amnesty law, and they're trying to state that Rios Montt has amnesty for the genocide that took place. And that's currently running alongside the genocide case. So,
because it was acts of war, it wasn't genocide.
Right.
That's the argument.
Right.
Because they were subversives, and you have to do what you have to do.
yeah. So we're in a situation where impunity continues to reign in Guatemala, and people like Antonio Cabacaba continue to fight and struggle for justice. And I think, especially in a film like this, that ongoing everyday struggle, where you don't get to go home at the end of the day and sort of look out over, the New York skyline and think about those years back then when you were doing inspiring, moving work. But every day when you go home and you're trying to deal with the realities of living in a country that continues to oppress and continues to murder and disappear your family members and your friends and members of your community. And that is going on today. So I knew I was going to be sort of the negative, the negative space here, but I've worked with the Association for Justice and Reconciliation since 2003, and their work is extremely inspiring and extremely dangerous. And it was pretty painful for a lot of people when they didn't see that work recognized in this film. So I guess in terms of how do each of us weave our own responsibility, I think it's important in this history, I think it's important to look at films like this and to remember that some voices are silenced, and to try to uncover some of the history of struggle and resistance that we don't often hear about. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Omar, your turn. That's great to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thanks to the organizer of this event and all of you for being present and learn a little bit more about this very emblematic case of impunity and genocide in Guatemala. I'd like to give you a little bit of information about what Caren already mentioned about what's going on with this Rios Montt case. Finally, the Guatemalan judge, one of the Guatemalan judges, is facing this case, and today specifically, the audience was suspended, and it's going to be on Monday when he's going to give a decision about if Riosmont should face the trial for genocide. As most of you know, Riosmont was the president of Guatemala during a short period of time, from 1982 to 1983. But during that very short period of time, and as a journalist, I had the experience of looking at some very, very dramatic cases, specifically in the north of the country, in El Quiché, where the Triángulo Ixil is located, and in Alta Verapaz, where a big work is being done with all these exhumations that are taking place at the area where the military base was established in the 1980s. So I believe that it's important to have screening of movies like this where we all can get more information and get more education about what happened in a country like Guatemala, where impunity has been the norm during all these 30 years or since these processes started. And it's important to mention that Riosmont and his defense team have been delaying the process, have been delaying the decision if he should face the charges of genocide, and by using different ways of appealing, even though the lawyers know that they are not going to be granted. They have been using them just as a way of delaying and delaying and delaying, just gaining time for him. And what Caren was mentioning about this Decreto, I know this decree, or yeah, that was approved lately in 2012, which is related with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. It's just another way of trying to protect Riosmont and two more generals that are being that are part of this process. And it's very, very hard to mention because they have been using over 100 appeals trying to delay this process. But we are hopeful that next week, next Monday, we can hear something that we have been waiting for a very, very long time. There is no doubt that we are very, very close to getting into a failed state in Guatemala City. And as a consequence of this, there have been too many facts that Caren was mentioning too about the that most of these areas that were affected during the policies of the 1980s, when the government instituted that policy of scorched earth. In those areas is where most of those recent conflicts are happening right now. The mining problem is very, very serious. It's very scary what's going on in all those provinces where mining is happening, where some Canadian companies are working. And with the production of electricity, it's exactly the same problem. Most of those big companies are set up in those areas that were affected during the Civil War. And now, we see a government that is trying to keep the status quo that has been kept all these years. How are they doing that? they are doing it by trying to criminalize all the social movements that are protesting against all this new stuff going on with the mining, with electricity production, with cement companies. And so I believe you were very, very right when you are saying that we are investing, or there is money and time being invested in investigating all what happened in the 80s. And it's very important to know, because we need to create this historical memory in order to learn and avoid this happening again. But maybe we also should be giving lots of attention to what's going on right now. The mining problems are very serious. The production of electricity is getting more serious too. And the government is trying to criminalize any group that is protesting or demanding some rights over those companies. I believe that this government, the current government, is doing that because what they are trying to do is just keep the country the way it has been during all these years. But I believe that this type of films, educational films, even though they are kind of directed for the North American people, it's important that they're being shown also in the country, because as Mr. Mioño said, we are a generation that are just about turning the corner, right? So it's necessary for the new generations to take over, to keep fighting and focusing on what happened during the civilian war, because this is important. But maybe more important is to focus on what's going on from now on, because I'm pretty sure that what's left for this government, the Partido Patriota, is going to be a very, very tough time for them. We are looking at so many social movements in all the areas of the country. So I believe Guatemala is going to get very, very interesting during the next few weeks, especially next week with the decision when Real Montt is going to hear if he's going to go on trial or not. We really hope that he will, but we never know, because Guatemala is a country where impunity has been there during the last years, since 1954. And what I can say is, let's hope that something happens on Monday.
Thank you. Any questions for the panelists? You all spoke so well that no one has anything left to ask. Yes?
Sorry,
Yeah. Oh, okay, great.
I had a, can you hear me? I had a question for the two females, actually, on the panel. One of the things that was interesting to me as a Guatemalan that Caren said during her the time that she spoke was being a white Canadian female. And I've always been interested as a Guatemalan as to what compels people that are Canadian, such as yourselves, Carlotta and Caren. What compels you to go to a country like Guatemala when there is other options? There is other countries in the developing world that have a tragic history filled with oppression and the rest. So why Guatemala?
Well, I'll say quickly,
Sure.
my mother is Guatemalan, so
Okay.
I'm Media Chapina too. Okay. So that's the proximate reason for
I didn't think because of the last name.
No, I know, but that is, I mean, for me, in fact, I mean, as I was growing up, we went every year to Guatemala, and then the 1980s came and we stopped going because there was a war. And so I think for me, in some ways, addressing all this is you know, there's moments where it's really about recuperating this beautiful, you know, when you get into it, it's not always as beautiful as you remember, of course. But for me, definitely, there's a personal element about understanding what that meant, about not being able to go anymore, and all that kind of stuff. So that's.
It's funny that you ask why Guatemala, because I actually have that written down as a question. One of the pieces that we were sort of asked to talk about, which we haven't really gotten to, is what can Canadians do? And I think, so I have so many answers to this question, because I think that when I first went down to Guatemala in 2001, I was 22, I just gave my age away. I was very young, and I identify a little bit with the woman with the braids, this sort of eager, naive, possibly a little bit stupid girl who didn't really know what she was doing and that wasn't really sure what it even meant to do social justice or human rights work in general, let alone do it outside of a country. And I think there's probably some very problematic reasons why I first chose to do the work that I ended up doing in Guatemala. I think that I thought that I was going to go, at that time I thought that I was going to go and help campesinos who were struggling for labor rights on coffee plantations, and I thought that I was going to go in there and do something about that. And I think that through the years that I lived there, I started realizing how very wrong that was. And I also began recognizing some of my own racism and some of my own levels of colonialism and what that means not only in a Guatemalan context, but also here in Canada. So I'm quite critical of Caren as a 23-year-old woman, actually. And so through the years, I feel that I've challenged myself to really think through, what it means to be in solidarity, which I still think is really complicated. And just recently I read, or I guess a couple of years ago, I read a book by Barbara Herron, who's actually a professor here in social work. But she wrote a book that's called The Desire for Development. And it sort of talks about white women who go down to the continent of Africa and come back to tell their stories, their heroic stories. And so she really problematizes, and she problematizes that, but she also puts it into this sort of historic colonial context of women who, even women who first came to Canada to colonize, and their roles as nurses and educators and working with the savages and helping the heathens, see Christianity. And I think that's also something that has been spoken to quite a lot about by Judith Butler in terms of the history of Jewish women. And so I've really been thinking a lot about that question, especially now that I'm back in Canada, because I'm trying to figure out how my work in Guatemala can also politicize and inform the work that I need to be doing here in Canada, in relation to Idle No More, and in relation to Indigenous sovereignty, and in addition to issues around land defense here in Canada that looks exactly the same as land defense in Guatemala and other countries, where we're seeing Canadian mining companies and hydroelectric projects and oil companies invading land that has not been ceded. And so I think that the why Guatemala question is for me a complicated one, and it's one that, while I've now spent 11 years of my life there, and I feel like I also feel a responsibility to continue to explore how Canada supports the current Guatemalan National Plan for Security and Development, how we're funneling money to fund UN peacekeepers in Guatemala who were sent to the Congo, and the problematics of that. So why Guatemala has now turned into, how do I extend the work that I've done in Guatemala to a broader political spectrum here in Canada and abroad.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I think we all appreciate the panel's contribution to this event tonight. I'd like to address my question to the gentleman. You've observed Guatemalan history for years, and you're also immediately informed of events that we don't know anything about, because we don't get the Guatemalan press coming over CTV the way perhaps it should. So my question is this: would you speculate as to the reaction of the country to the two possibilities of the outcome of the court or this tribunal? What if he's indicted and sent to trial? What if he's acquitted? How will the country react? And also, what effect would that have on the small L license of the industrialization on the lands of the indigenous people that was taken from them? Thank you.
Ooh. Hard to say, but Guatemala is a very, very, it's very hard to say. Obviously, we are very well divided back home. There is a group of people that are hoping for the general to be brought to justice, right? But he also has a few supporters that are very radical too. So Guatemala has a society that is very, very well divided, and this case is not the exception. Of course, most of us are waiting for him to be brought to justice. There is a few that are hoping the other way. When I was driving down here, I was asking me that question too. What's going to happen on Monday? Because myself, I don't know what's going to happen. There is lots of evidence already presented to the Spanish court and to the different judges in Guatemala. We saw in the movie all the forensic work, all those reports have been presented by the public attorney, the Guatemalan public attorney. There is lots of testimony, lots of evidence, but Guatemala is a rare country. We don't know what's going to happen on Monday. I really don't know. On the other hand, what repercussions is going to have this decision on those big projects, mining, electricity, cement, oil? I don't think there is going to be an impact as a result of this decision that's going to be given maybe Monday or anytime soon, because those are already very well-established companies. Most of them are international, and this decision, I don't think is going to affect them. But what might affect, or what's affecting them already, is the opposition that is already taking place by the communities where those plants or these mining companies are set up. And the response from the government has been the same: violence. Violence. In Huehuetenango, in Barrias, they put a estado de sitio. I know how to translate that into English.
Siege, but yeah.
They put
Martial
some
law.
prohibitions to the, and in San Jose del Golfo, which is very, very close to the city, same thing. In Santa Rosa, to the other side of the country. So the country is all over with conflicts because of the authorization of the setting up of all these companies, because they never ask the communities. Someone in the government, whatever it is, whatever ministry it is, they just authorize the mining companies, they authorize the projects to generate electricity, they just authorize everything without consulting the communities. So now there is a case in the Constitutional Court that was presented just this week too, about some electricity projects taking place in the Triángulo Ischil area, which is one of the most affected areas during the war. And so I don't think there's going to be a consequence of the decision from the judge next week, but the government has already lots of trouble because of not consulting with the communities. They're protesting, and I believe they have the right to protest because they have no benefits of those companies going into their areas to contaminate the environment, to use the water, to use their land. What are they getting? Nothing, nothing.
Hi, good evening. My name is François Tanguay-Renaud. I'm the director of the Nathanson Center here at Osgoode. I'm one of those lawyers that you were referring to. Pero primeramente les quería agradecer por su participación y sus palabras muy fuertes. Gracias. So I guess my comment or question has to, I mean, Carlota got me thinking when she said, you know, these people in the villages had a conception of rights that's quite different from the conception of rights that we may have here in Canada right now, conception of human rights. And then that got me back. Thankfully, I have one of these new iPhones. I'm starting to discover it. And it got me back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where in the preamble it says, whereas it is essential if man, it's written in 1948 or some odd years, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. And then I thought to myself, well, that's interesting that it's there. Then I got back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1791. Right after the French Revolution. And Article 2 says, the aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression. Interesting. We don't have this in our Canadian Constitution. It's not there. But I've actually looked into this, and there are 40 constitutions around the world which have this right to rebel, this right to resist oppression, entrenched in the Constitution. Now, should people resort to such means? Well, one might think, well, actually, what are the benefits of seeking justice, seeking to uphold human rights in a case like we're talking here through the justice system? Because I listened to Oscar, and there seems to be a lot of hope. You say, we're with great anticipation waiting to see what the court is going to say on Monday. We want the court to say a certain thing, and why is that the case? You see all these piles of documents. People are going through 30 years looking to ascertain what? Well, the truth, right? So that process is conducive to getting out certain facts. It's conducive to putting in front of us a record of history. But it's also in the Guatemalan courts right now asking the Guatemalan states to recognize and to disown this kind of behavior, to say, we Guatemala are not this right now. And I'm not a Guatemalan, but you're telling us about the situation right now, the mining company. You want a strong state. You want a state that's able to say, well, from now on, we're going to uphold certain rights, right? In the face of these multinational companies, including Canadian companies, to come in here. So you want, in this case, the court to say, well, we're going to uphold human rights with respect to this past situation. So it seems to me that there is at least some value going in that direction, because the costs of seeking justice by self-help can be tremendous, right? The kind of excesses that can be committed. And there's a reason why the Human Rights Declaration says, well, you know, as a last resort, and yes, we acknowledge that power is at the bottom of it all, but we should try to, you know, bring reason to the situation. When I look at Obama using drones to achieve justice, going to kill Obama and then its own citizens in Yemen, I'm thinking, you know, is that the kind of justice that we want to aspire to? But then the question is there the rule of law in Guatemala right now, right? Are there institutions that are strong enough to actually enforce human rights? And it seems to me that you're hoping for this, right? You want the courts to say yes. At the same time, you're pretty doubtful that they're going to do it. And so what's the solution to this? Well, should we go back to self-help, to resistance? And it seems that Guatemala is really in that state of flux, of transition, where you can't give up either options, right? But I'm happy to see that you think you still have some hopes with respect to the court. At the same time, you say, well, in our villages, we still need to organize. So that's what I just wanted to point out, because these comments spurred all these thoughts, and I'd like to share your hope that the Guatemalan courts are going to stand up. We have a project here at Osgoode, a colleague of mine is trying to hold some of these Canadian mining companies to account in Canadian courts, because we'd like to think that we have a state that upholds the rule of law. Don't know what's going to happen, but it's great that we're in partnership and having these discussions. I really liked your comments with respect to what can we do in Canada here, maybe to support your struggle there. So just wanted to thank you and share these thoughts with you. Thank you.
Time for maybe one more question, and then we should call it. You, sir? Yes.
Too high for me. Sorry. Thanks for this wonderful discussion. My question to the gentleman, since you're a journalist, I want to ask about the freedom of expression and the challenges that journalists are undergoing right now. Because through many of the human rights reports and Amnesty reports, I see that many of the activists and the journalists, especially the feminists, the feminists who are struggling for indigenous rights, they're being under attack all the time. So how this is now, and compared to how it has been, and are things getting better day by day or not?
Sorry, I didn't quite get your
yeah,
question.
My question is about press freedom. And the challenges that journalists and human rights advocates are undergoing right now. Did things get better throughout the years, if we want to compare it to the past, whether in the 80s or the 90s, compared to what's happening right now? The state of press of freedom as journalists. What are the challenges that journalists in Guatemala are undergoing now when they are covering their stories?
Okay, just let me ask, maybe Julio can help me out translating the question so I can really understand clearly.
You want to repeat it now?
Sorry for that.
¿Cuál es la diferencia si usted la compara desde hace años, la cuestión de la libertad que tienen los periodistas para hablar libremente?
Okay.
¿Se ha cambiado desde hace tiempo?
Okay, no, thank you. Sorry for that. I wasn't sure exactly what your question was, but now I can respond to you. I was an active journalist in Guatemala from 1985 until I left to come to Canada into exile in 1993, right? So as a journalist at that time, it was a very, very hard time. Remember that the civilian war was still going on, and all those secret police groups were still going all over the city, and not only the city, but the whole country were covered by them. And as journalists, we had the problem that we had to measure ourselves, how far we could go. And for those ones that couldn't make the line and they went over, most of them are in those places that we saw people being exhumed, right? So it was very hard, and I have experience that I would like to share with you very shortly. We had the communities of population in resistance in the north of the country, in Guatemala in the 80s, right? Mid-80s, end of the 80s. And at one point, I got a good contact in order to go to those communities where there were no access to get to them. The only way to get to them was through flying, right? Because there were no roads, and the war was concentrated in that area of El Quiché. So because I got that contact, I said, well, it's a good opportunity. And there was a group of lawmakers from Netherlands and Canada going to the communities. And I talked to Rosalina Tuyuk, and she said to me, there is only one space available. If you want to take it, you can take it. So I asked my editor, and he said, well, if you want to take it, just go. And I went to the community population and resistance for 1 week. It was maybe the most exciting experience that I had during my years as a journalist back home. Starting with the food, with the place to sleep, with everything, the people, and it was very, very exciting. Before I left, my editor told me, oh, don't worry about that. We don't have too much space for that kind of stuff, so prepare some material for like 1 page at the most, or a small story. And I said, okay, no problem, I want to go, because I was interested in going. And I took, of course, some pictures and interviewed some people, and 1 week being there, it was so nice. I came back to the paper, and I was so excited. I talked to my editor, and when he saw the way I was telling him the story of this, the story of that, so he got excited too. And he said, why we don't talk? Let's make a small magazine, 8 pages, with all these stories that you are telling me. Will you be able to write 8 pages? I said, oh, of course, I'll be willing to do that. And I did. And we got all the material ready. It went through the edition, and at that time we were separating the colors for the pictures, and everything was finished. And we were going to publish it on Sunday. And I remember that Saturday, I left the paper at around 10 p.m., went home, and as I was going to bed, I got the phone call from my editor. He said, look, we got a problem here. The magazine is already at the shop. It's being printed. But we got a couple of phone calls that someone is going to die if we present that story. So it's up to you. So I told him, oh, no problem, man. Take the risk. Just go ahead. Do it. And he said, oh, well, if you want, we can do it. But your name is on, and you are responsible for the whole work. And I hung up, and like half an hour later, he called me again. Said, I believe we should reconsider it. I said, no, I don't want to reconsider it. I want to go with it. It's a work I've been doing during the last 3 weeks, and I don't want to throw it away. Finally, he convinced me. No, you got a wife, you got kids, you got family, and we don't want this to be the cause of something fatal in your family. So he said to me, we're going to postpone it. We're going to publish it later on. And the original of that document is still sitting here in my house in Brampton. We never published it. Never. So I'm telling you this story just to let you know that at that time we had to put the line until where we could go, because we had too many taboo issues at the time. Writing about anything against the army was a taboo issue. You couldn't do that. If you did, you took your risks. At that time, drug trafficking wasn't as strong as these days. Now it's a real problem. Trafficking is a real problem in Guatemala. It's maybe one of the main problems going on right now. At that time, it was just starting to grow. But writing about trafficking was another thing that you didn't want to do because you were going to get in trouble. What's the difference between then and now? Big difference. At that time, many, many journalists, even some of my classmates, got killed. Roberto Martinez, Victor Cruz. I can mention names of classmates that were killed working as journalists. I was happy to leave the country and being here, but many of them decided to stay and they had no chance to survive. These days it's a little bit different. The space is a little bit more open now. People can write. Journalists can write. They can write almost anything now. Of course, they are taking their chances as well. But before it was very, very complicated, and we knew it, and we knew it well by experience. Lots of co-workers just got killed. Now, during the last years, there had been some assassinations, but not as many as it was in the past. So it looks like, in that sense, we are a little bit better. We have to recognize that, in that sense, a little bit better. But anything can happen.
Thank you. That was great. Really appreciate all three of you coming, and thank you for coming to this event. If you're interested in any other events that we're hosting, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table. You can be put on our email list, and we'll let you know when things are coming up. And also, there are DVDs of both Granito, the longer version, which you saw before, and also When the Mountains Tremble, for sale for $20 each, if anyone's interested in that. Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Just before leaving, I wonder if you give me the chance to let you know that on February the 1st, which is the coming Friday, February the 1st, at Casa Maiz, 1230 Finch Avenue West, second floor, ASOGUATE is going to be screening the documentary, The Renaissance of the Mayas, El Renacimiento de los Mayas. We are doing that in commemoration of the 33rd anniversary of the burning of the Spanish embassy in Guatemala. So all of you are invited if you want to come by on February the 1st at 7 p.m. at Casa Maiz, 1230 Finch Avenue West. You're going to be welcome there. We're going to have the screening of this documentary, and we'll have a chat after that. Thank you.